Okay, the next thing I want to talk about are false positives. And a false positive, we can think of that as the old cry wolf syndrome. All right, so we're saying something's there when it's really not. And with regard to false positives, we need to make sure that we have controls that are put in place, whether it's our intrusion detection systems or our unified threat management systems, whatever the case might be, our security pieces of software and processes, etc. Once they're put in place, we need to make sure that we routinely audit them and review them to make sure that the rule sets that are in place are not generating an excessive amount of false positives. We need to make sure that we're correctly identifying things that are there and not generating so many that we just start ignoring, right? Because if we have incorrect rule sets in our intrusion detection system, as an example, and we start generating 30, 40, 50, 100, 200 false positives a day, well, what happens? Human nature is we're just going to start ignoring them, right? We're not even going to pay any attention. And when we get to that point, what happens is reality sets in, and ones that really are, in fact, issues can slip by and we miss them. All right, so we need to make sure that we review and ensure policies are set up properly, and we need to make sure that false positives are not excessive because, as I said, they can really take up a lot of our attention, and ultimately we can end up ignoring them. All right, so the average worker, some of the studies that I've read and through some of the research, the average IT specialist can really address each incident or each alarm. Takes about 5 minutes per, and that's even rushing it a little bit. All right, it's not really giving the true amount of time that's necessary. However, some may take more time than others, so the average, just to say 5 minutes. So if we have a system that is generating an inordinate number of false positives, let's say 200 or 300 a day, it's really impossible to spend 3 to 4 or 5 minutes or 10 minutes on each one of those alarms. There's just not enough time in the workday. So by doing that, invariably something's going to slip by. All right, so we want to make sure that we tune our systems so that we do not generate these false positives. All right, the opposite of that would be false negatives. False negatives are, as we can understand, the opposite of false positives. All right, so in other words, we have an incident, but we failed to correctly recognize it. All right, so that could be the result of controls are set up improperly, operator error, things along those lines. All right, so it's kind of the opposite of a cry wolf situation. The wolf is actually there, but we're not saying anything. We just go on about our business. So so you have an understanding of the differentiation between those two terms. Now, talking from a statistical standpoint, there are really classified as type 1, type 2, and type 3. There's also type 4 and 5 you'll read about occasionally, but I just wanted to make types 1, 2, and 3 call to your attention, rather, just because they kind of line up with the false positives and false negatives. So a type 1 would be a false positive, a type 2 would be a false negative, and then a type 3 means you arrive at the right conclusion, but for the wrong reasons. All right, so I just want to make you aware of the terminologies, just so you have some level of awareness there. Now, moving forward with our policies and not making sure we don't have things generating false positives or false negatives, things aren't slipping by, we need to make sure that we understand the importance of policies in reducing risk. All right, so policies provide for standards. Those standards govern and give us guidance for our use and behavior within our corporate environment, right? So such things as a privacy policy, an acceptable use policy, security policy, these things are very important because they govern and give us a set of guidelines that we know, okay, this type of behavior is acceptable, this type of behavior is not. We can visit this website, we can't visit that website. We can use this system for our work use or maybe even for personal use while we're at work. This type of behavior we can't do. All right, same thing with security policies and so forth. So it's very important to understand that these policies need to be put in place. They need to be clearly defined so that each and every person understands, and has guidance or advice, if you will, on how to proceed. They're not necessarily hard, fast rules. They can be, but generally speaking, they're guidelines so that a person can read through the policy, the user handbook, the user manual and guide and so forth, and say, okay, I understand that I'm not allowed to do this. It cuts down on legal requirements. It cuts down on people doing things that they shouldn't be able to do or shouldn't do. And in doing so, just through the use of policy, we can basically effectively implement a higher level of security, because if someone's not trying to poke around and do things that they're not supposed to do, our systems that are in place to kind of catch that, yes, they're there. But if we don't have to even get to that point, if people just kind of self-regulate and realize that's not acceptable, well, that's half the battle in getting to a very secure or to a much more secure environment. Okay, now the next thing is mandatory vacations. And you might think to yourself, whoa, where can I work for a company that gives mandatory vacations or requires mandatory vacations? Well, the reasoning behind it and again, depends on the industry, but a lot of industries will require mandatory vacations because it keeps personnel or keeps people away from the company and the company assets for a period of time. Now, you may think to yourself, well, all right, why? What's the big deal? Well, when you have someone, especially in a high position of trust, or someone that is in a position where they can really affect a lot of large-scale financial transactions, it is in the best interest of the company to require these mandatory vacations where you have a complete disassociation or a disconnection from the company for a period of time, whether it be a week or 2 weeks, because that then gives the company the time and the opportunity to see anomalies, right? So if someone is doing, especially if they're acting in a fraudulent or a collusive way, so that they're actually trying to, steal money, fraud, embezzlement, things along those lines. If that's happening and they're doing a good job of covering up their tracks, things may not be seen. But as soon as that person is gone for 2 weeks, then all of a sudden, then you see a blip on the radar because things that were happening consistently no longer are happening. All right. By the same token, it also allows someone else to come in and take over that job for a 2 week period of time, or 1 week or 2 weeks, whatever it is. So as someone new takes over that role for the period of time, they're going to do things differently. Potentially, they're going to do things, quote unquote, the right way. Now, so if someone was previously doing things the wrong way or was, hiding something, the new person that steps in, it makes those types of activities come up to the surface, because now the person that's doing things the proper way is going to raise a red flag and say, wait a minute, we were operating at this level before, this new person stepped in, all of a sudden now things are 20%, 50% more efficient, or making 20% more profit, or whatever the case might be. All right, so it really just boils down to the mandatoriness of that vacation requires them to step away. They can't have access to email. They can't have access to phone or text or anything to do with corporate assets. Maybe their login ID and their VPN access is revoked for a period of time. So that way it gives you a much cleaner period to go in and do some type of forensic analysis, or just a kind of a general housekeeping to make sure that things are being done correctly. Now, along those same lines are separation of duties. All right, so it's a security practice that doesn't allow one person to control all facets of a transaction. All right, so it's checks and balances, for lack of a better term. All right, so whether that means someone who's writing checks should not also be the person that is actually approving the checks, or approval for expenditures. So bookkeeping, accounting, you don't want someone to do both sides or both ends of a transaction. You want to separate those out. So one person can maybe write the check, the other person can sign it, or maybe it requires two signatures, or the person writing the check isn't the person that actually handles the accounting, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you get the idea. Because if you let one person do everything and there's no checks and balances, there's no one kind of looking over their shoulder, so to speak, that gives the opportunity for malicious or criminal behavior to take hold. All right, so it keeps one person from wearing too many hats. All right, so that's the concept of separation of duties. Along the same lines again is something called job rotation. So a job rotation is kind of hand in hand with separation of duties. It keeps one person from becoming so ingrained that they can easily engineer ways to embezzle, institute fraud, so on and so forth. All right, so in other words, a person stays in a job for, let's say, 2-3 months, 6 months, then they're rotated out to another position. All right, so that keeps one person from becoming just like having the company kind of at ransom, so to speak, because they're the only person that knows how to do this specific function. All right, so the thing you have to keep in mind, though, or be aware of, is the concept of job creep or responsibility creep, because that's where one person can retain rights and privileges as they move from one role to another. So it's very important to make sure that as a person gets removed from one role and placed into another, that their privileges that they had in the previous role are also revoked. All right, so we want to maintain the concept of least privileges. So that way we make sure that the person only has enough privileges and enough rights to do the job that they're assigned to do. And again, just to kind of circle back, as a person moves from, let's say, accounting to finance to, whatever, you name it, HR, we want to make sure that if they're in HR now, they still don't have finance capability or finance, access to payroll or access to, checks and accounts payable, accounts receivable, so on and so forth. So that's the concept of job rotation, and then the concept of least privileges.